Hi everyone. So today we're going to talk about the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment is just an intellectual and philosophical movement that dominated the world of ideas in Europe during the 16 and 1700s. Now, this just basically means new ideas were coming out during this time. People were thinking about things differently. And this is sometimes referred to the Age of Light, and the reason that I talk about this is because the philosophy underlying all of this was that old ideas needed to be exposed to the light of investigation. We needed to actually investigate why we hold the beliefs that we do, and then through that investigation determine whether we should still hold on to these old ideas. And in order to understand the Enlightenment, we got to talk a little bit about Europe before the Enlightenment happens. And this is a US history course, so it may seem weird that we're talking about Europe, but trust me, we're going to get to US in just a minute. But basically, in Europe during this time, the norm was religious orthodoxy. The norm was that everyone was deeply, deeply religious, that the Catholic Church was the center of life for most Europeans, and that people tended to live their lives by the teachings of the church. This meant that the church was the most powerful organization in European society during this time, but also because most European countries subscribed to the idea of divine right of kings, the idea that kings and queens were chosen by God to rule their country. This meant that monarchs should also be very powerful, because if religion is at the center of society, and if God is choosing the kings and queens that are ruling over those societies, then they should therefore have absolute power, be allowed to do whatever they want. So obedience to authority is really kind of the common thread here. Everything is about you obey authority, and if scientific discovery, if an observation about the world around you seems to conflict with something in the Bible, that religious doctrine is upheld, not the scientific discovery. And where does this come from, this idea of obedience to authority? Well, this is really reflected through the ideas of philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, who publishes a book called Leviathan in 1651, and I just want to read a brief excerpt from it. It says, with man's natural state being evil, if any two men desire the same thing, which nevertheless they cannot both enjoy, they become enemies, and endeavor to destroy one another. And when it comes to pass, that's when they don't fear the other man's power, they will come prepared with forces united to take away his possessions, not only the fruit of his labor, but also his life and liberty. By consequence, to conserve a man's well-being, and to secure them in such a way that they may enjoy the fruits of this earth, nourish themselves, and live contentedly, is to give over all their power and strength upon one man, or upon one assembly of men, that may reduce all their wills by plurality of voices unto one will, that their judgment to his judgment. So what is he saying here? Well, the first line pretty much says everything you need to see, with man's natural state being evil. In other words, people are bad, and if you leave people alone, they're going to do bad things. In particular, they're going to fight over limited resources. If they can't both have it, one's going to kill the other, right? And so, if people are bad, and if people are going to necessarily fight over resources, what you need to do is you need to get a strong king in place. And that king should be powerful enough to stamp out man's natural evil tendencies. And this is the center of political thought in Europe up until about the 1650s. But this starts to change in the late 1600s, early 1700s. So why does this start to change? Well, part of the reason is that in the 1600s, Europe enters into a period of relative abundance. Now, up until this point, for most of European history, Europe had been a land of famine, bare subsistence, meaning most of the people there were barely growing enough food to survive. But as these new crops from the Americas start to come into cultivation in Europe, in particular the potato was massive for places like Ireland. Corn, tomatoes, peppers. Suddenly, the European population could feed itself, and the number of calories that the average person consumes daily grows. This opens people's minds, because a lot of what they've been doing up to this point is driven by the fact that they're kind of on the brink of starvation and catastrophe, right? Most of Europe is perpetually fighting against each other for the 1400s, 1500s, the 1600s. They continue up into the 1700s as well. But this starts to open some people's minds to the idea that this doesn't have to be the way that it is. We don't have to constantly fight over resources. Maybe it's possible that we can live not on the brink of starvation and catastrophe, that we can easily feed our entire population. But also this happens because the age of exploration had happened. We're settling in the Americas. There's a lot of travel into the East. And after the invention of the printing press, the people that do travel, they can write about their experience, and that those experiences can make their way to people that are able to read and able to access that. And so new ideas about new cultures start to make their way into Europe. And I don't know if you've ever done something a certain way your whole life, and then you just see someone do it completely differently, and it just never even occurred to you that you could do it differently. That's kind of what's happening here. They're seeing all these different cultures that live in very different ways, right? They see societies that aren't constantly at war with one another. They see societies that don't build rigid social hierarchies based on who your parents are, that actually reward individual talent and things like that. And when they start seeing that other societies can run in different ways, they start questioning all of these ideas that had been the foundation of European society at this time. So, the central ideas that come out of the Enlightenment is the idea that human and reasoning, that observing the world around you and thinking about it could discover truths about the world, and that you could use these observations and your reasoning power to improve the lives of humankind. And this went along with being skeptical about the wisdom that you received, right? Just because an authority tells you something does not necessarily make it true. So everything should be subjected to testing and rational analysis. And another major core idea of the Enlightenment is the idea of religious tolerance, the idea that an individual, if they can decide truths about the world, they should also be able to decide truths about ideas of religion, that they should be free from coercion in their personal lives. So, I'm just going to touch on some of the major figures of the Enlightenment, particularly the ones that impacted the growth of the American form of government. The first is the Enlightenment thinker John Locke. He believed, in direct opposition of Thomas Hobbes, who said humankind is naturally evil, right? He says, no, that's wrong. Humankind is essentially good, and if we just get out of people's way, that they're going to do good things, and that people are born with natural rights, meaning rights not given to them by the king as a citizen of a country, but they're just inherent to our existence as humans. And he identifies three rights in particular: the right to life, the right to liberty, and the right to property ownership. Now, if life, liberty, and property sounds familiar, it's because this was basically borrowed by Thomas Jefferson when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. And he starts off by saying, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator. Again, natural rights, you're born with them, they're not given to you. Endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So he changes it a bit, but he borrows directly from Locke. The next thinker I wanted to go through is Rousseau. Now, Rousseau argued that citizens in a society voluntarily enter into a social contract with their government. In other words, while you're technically freer if you live in a society with no government, right? Governments have rules. There's certain things that you cannot do if you live in a society with a government. You give up some of those freedoms, but you do so voluntarily, because ultimately having a government protects other rights of yours. right? So they limit what you can do, but they also help ensure order in society. They also ensure that if someone does something bad to you, that there will be consequences to that person's actions. So you are protected in some ways. So you voluntarily want to form a government. But this is a social contract. And the authority in this social contract is in the hands of citizens. And if a ruler fails to live up to the duties of that social contract, the king or queen abuses their authority, then it is the right of the people to replace them with someone that will live up to the terms of that social contract. And I'm just going to go back to this same paragraph in the Declaration of Independence, because right after he says, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, he says, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive to these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government. Right? So our entire foundation for why we break free from Britain, it's borrowed directly from these two thinkers, from John Locke and from Rousseau. The next person I want to go over is Baron de Montesquieu. Now Montesquieu, he was concerned primarily with the way power corrupts in government. Right? The predominant European thinking up to this point was that a king needed absolute power. They got their right to rule from God, and therefore they should be able to do whatever they want. And Hobbes said people are bad, so it's good to have a strong king that is going to kind of force people to abandon their evil desires. Montesquieu looked at it differently. He said, no, actually, power tends to corrupt people. And if we give a king too much power, they're going to tend to be a corrupt king. So he saw the solution as separating the powers of government, right? You don't just give all authority to a king, that if you can divide the different powers of government, like, say, deciding what laws people should follow, maybe that shouldn't be up to the king. Trying people that have broken one of those laws, maybe that shouldn't be up to the king, right? And so if you can create different branches of government that each handle different aspects of governing, then no one of those branches will get too much power. Now, this directly influences the US Constitution, right? We divide our government up into three branches. The legislative branch, which is Congress, which decides what laws we have to follow. The judicial branch, which tries people if they break those laws and decides what those laws mean. And the executive, whose job is to actually carry out those laws and bring them into existence and enforce them. So, what are the effects of the Enlightenment? In particular, they undermine the authority of monarchies and the church, right? Because if you're questioning traditional wisdom, the holders of that traditional wisdom were the rulers and were the church. And so we start to see people questioning this stuff more than they ever had before. And this really paves the way for a lot of the political revolutions that we see in the 18th and 19th century. In particular, it paves the way for the American Revolution.